Tyler was walking slowly down the white steps, some of them cracked from time, to the river. He bundled himself in an old down jacket, bracing against the chilly grey November, the biting wind and icy particles falling from the sky. Here, near the river, winter's approach was palpable, the temperature significantly lower than in the city. Pulling his knitted hat over his ears, Tyler reminded himself he could not afford to get sick. Illness would mean additional spending from his very frugal savings. Such was the life of a poor and misfortunate person. Tyler had experienced worse times, even sleeping on heating mains and scavenging food from garbage dumps. Despite these hardships, he'd managed to somewhat stabilize his life. Although the dream of owning a corner was still far off, his current situation was markedly better than before. Tyler was raised in a small village, surrounded by beautiful aspen groves. He recalled his childhood as the happiest and most comfortable period of his life, often looking back with nostalgia. It wasn't merely the physical comforts, such as a roof over his head, clean sheets or a guaranteed meal each day, that he missed. It was the love he received and the fact that he wasn't alone. His gentle and kind grandmother Rachel was central to these memories. She was wise, forgiving, and warm. Tyler perceived her as omnipotent for a long time. She always knew what to say to soothe his worries and anxieties. She understood how to handle any situation and was respected by her neighbours, seeming to know everything in the world. She also seemed tireless. Tyler could not recall ever seeing her sleep. She was always busy with chores when he went to bed, and by the time he woke up, she was already up and about, freshly groomed and smiling. Rachel was a strong woman, tall, stately, and energetic. Later on, Tyler deeply missed his grandmother's presence, her comforting gaze, warm embraces, and soothing voice. He used to weep over his inability to change the past, blamed himself, and cried helplessly into the void. Hopelessness. That's how Tyler would describe his state. The loss of his home didn't terrify him. He was relatively uninterested in that. What mattered was his grandmother. She was gone. Tyler had no other relatives. It was just the way things were. In the village, where almost everyone had some form of in-laws, cousins, aunts and uncles, or distant relatives, it was unusual, but that's how it was. Tyler's grandmother came here as a young woman, following her husband, named Tom. He was a hard-working and skillful man who was respected at his job at the sawmill and by his neighbours. Rachel worked as a milkmaid on a farm, and they got along well and lived harmoniously. Both dreamed of having a large family with at least 5 children. However, they only had one child, a daughter named Eva. They planned to have more children, but as the years passed, Eva remained their only child. Eva grew into a beautiful girl who looked nothing like her parents. They were simple rustic folk, while she had delicate features, a slender figure, large violet eyes, and golden curls. She was like a princess. The locals often joked about whether Rachel had secretly brought such a beauty from the city. However, Tom never doubted his wife's fidelity. The girl's character matched her appearance, languid, capricious, and self-loving. When Eva recognized her attractive appearance, her pride intensified. Her parents were simple, hard-working people. Their family's lifestyle was no different from others, yet Eva believed she deserved more. She aspired to live in a big city and blamed her parents for not moving there earlier. She demanded toys, outfits, and jewellery from her parents and refused to do housework, claiming she needed to study, not sweep floors, as she did not plan to stay in the village for long. However, Eva's studies were unconventional. She did not focus on school subjects, but on imitating the models she saw in magazines. She experimented with makeup and fashion, striving for perfection. She taught herself how to combine various wardrobe elements and style her golden hair differently. This all began when she was around 14 years old, perhaps even earlier. "I'll move to the city, become a photo model, maybe even go abroad. I certainly won't live in this swamp," she declared. Rachel and Tom looked at each other confused. They blamed themselves for their daughter's attitude, but they couldn't pinpoint where they had gone wrong. Rachel had grown up in stark poverty and had always gone hungry, so she may have overcompensated by indulging her only daughter. Tom, having been raised almost without any parental love, was naturally spoiling his long-awaited child as well. Nevertheless, they tried to instill basic moral and ethical principles in Eva. They taught her the importance of work and respect for others. Rachel showed her daughter how to bake pies and clean the house. Yet even as a child, Eva rejected these values, making it clear she yearned for a different life. During her teenage years, Eva's contempt for her parents intensified. She dismissed them as losers who knew nothing about life. "You have no right to teach me," she would shout at her parents when they tried to guide her. "You've achieved nothing. Both of you work for pennies. But I'm not like you. I want a different life. I'll marry a rich man or become a model." Tom tried to reason with her. "Who'll marry you? Such an unprepared girl. You can't cook or clean. Your mother still takes care of you." Eva retorted, "I won't marry a village fool. I'll marry a rich man who has servants to do all that." Indeed, Eva had plenty of admirers. As a beautiful girl, she attracted attention not only from her male classmates, but also from older men. This deeply alarmed her parents. Rachel and Tom tried to talk to her, but she merely laughed in response. In an attempt to protect her, Tom used to lock her at home, but Eva always found a way out, either through the window or by slipping out when her parents were distracted. She craved admiring glances and compliments. These things bolstered her self-confidence and her own belief in her own irresistibility, reinforcing her conviction that she deserved a better life. Eva dreamed of achieving this better life effortlessly. She had no interest in studying at school or college, considering it a long and difficult path, meant for those not fortunate enough to be born beautiful, with large violet eyes and golden curls. All of this, growing up, little Tyler was told about by their neighbour, Mrs. Peterson. She used to call his mother as a naughty girl. As for Rachel, she never spoke ill of her daughter. She only often sighed about her fate and blamed herself for failing to properly guide her. On the contrary, Mrs. Peterson always spoke the unvarnished truth, never attempting to soften the harsh realities. "Your mother was a beauty, I admit, but she was lazy. She wasn't very smart either. She aspired to reach great heights, but lacked the intellectual capacity. Hence, things turned out the way they did. It's not your grandparents' fault. They did everything they could for their daughter. They're good people. It's probably just genetics, likely from Tom's family. He was raised in an orphanage. And who sends children in such places? Only people like Eva. If it hadn't been for your grandparents, you would have been raised in an orphanage too." After school, Eva didn't want to pursue further studies. Therefore, her parents got her a job as a clerk in the local store. The girl kept living a monotonous life, still dreaming of a better future. Eva harboured resentment towards her circumstances, her parents, and the limitations of village life. She felt her dreams were unfulfilled. Despite her desire to escape to the city, her parents dissuaded her. Eva would have fled without a second thought if she had had the means and destination. She tried to get into modelling by sending her photos to an agency. However, to her surprise, she received no response. And then one day, a city guy named Paul visited their village. He came with a local friend to visit his parents. Paul was a university student and drove his own car, a gift from his father when he came of age. Handsome and stylish, Paul was like an actor from a youth show. Naturally, Eva was instantly attracted to him. and her rustic charm bewitched Paul, and they quickly became involved. It was Paul who took Eva to the city, and she moved into his apartment. While Paul studied, Eva became like a housewife, even cooking and cleaning to secure her place in the city. Thanks to Paul's father's money, they led a carefree and fun life, partying in clubs and restaurants, and even going on trips. Tom naturally travelled to the city in an attempt to bring his daughter home, but she refused to return. Since Eva was of legal age, she had every right to do so. Paul was her knight on a black Audi, who whisked her away from her despised village and judgmental parents. This was Eva's perception of her escape. She had finally broken free. However, her relationship with Paul didn't last long. He quickly found someone else, but Eva had no intention of returning to the village. She found a new love interest, not as affluent as Paul, but it was better than nothing. Despite the failure of this relationship too, another prospect was on the horizon. With time, Eva lowered her standards in suitors. The men came and went, but one thing remained constant. She lived off them, offering them her affection, youth and beauty in exchange for shelter, food, gifts and outings. Eva's life wasn't exactly as she had envisioned, but she still had no plans of returning to the village. Tom and Rachel were devastated to see their daughter's transformation. Eva's once vibrant golden curls had faded, her voice had become rough and hoarse, and her skin had assumed an unhealthy pallor. She started drinking heavily and smoking, which inevitably took a toll on her health and appearance. Tom was deeply concerned about the destructive path his only daughter had chosen. It was a significant shock for a father. Rachel held on to the hope that Eva would come to her senses, grow weary of her lifestyle and different men in her life. And besides, these men weren't wealthy, handsome men like Paul, but more akin to shabby, marginal-looking individuals. But they had jobs and money, which enabled Eva to live in the city at their expense. Eva had transformed from a golden-haired princess into a shabby woman with traces of disadvantage and vices in her appearance. It was difficult to imagine her former self. Now she was spiralling downhill, seemingly oblivious to her decline. Tom's heart ached for his daughter, causing him to suffer 2 successive heart attacks. Rachel was also distressed, but she clung to the hope that Eva, still young, could turn her life around. Tom, however, seemed resigned to the belief that nothing good would come from Eva's current path. But he didn't survive his 3rd heart attack, leaving Rachel alone in their village house. Her husband was gone, and her daughter lived a rowdy life in the city. This wasn't how Rachel had imagined her old years. At least, she had her job. She worked as a milkmaid on a farm, where she could socialize and escape the loneliness of her home. On New Year's Eve, something unexpected happened. Eva came to visit her. Upon seeing her, Rachel immediately started bustling around, preparing the table. Eva looked unwell, thin, pale, and with a puffy face. When Eva removed her jacket, Rachel noticed her round belly underneath her sweater. Eva was pregnant, seemingly far along. The baby's father was another of Eva's suitors, a truck driver. He earned decent money and spent it on hanging out when he wasn't on the road. His girlfriend's pregnancy was unplanned. When he found out, he panicked, confessing he already had a family in another city, a wife and 2 children. He didn't want another child, but the doctor refused to terminate the pregnancy because it was too late. After the news, her admirer fled in a disappointingly ordinary manner. Eva continued to live in the apartment for a few more months until the lease expired. Therefore, Eva found herself without suitors, their money, and had to return to her hometown. Rachel was hopeful. She believed that even without a father, the child would grow to be successful. She anticipated that motherhood would evoke tenderness and care in Eva. However, things did not pan out as expected. The baby was born prematurely, frail and tiny. He spent a month in an ICU for the newborns. Eva decided to give up on him because she perceived him as a burden, especially since he was sickly. She left the child at the hospital and returned to the city, ready to resume her old lifestyle. Upon learning about Eva's actions, Rachel rushed to the hospital. With her connection to an employee there, she managed to nullify Eva's waiver. However, they still needed Eva's presence and signature for the baby's documents. Initially, Eva was adamant about not wanting her son, suggesting that the orphanage was a better option. But Rachel persuaded her that the boy should stay in the family. She reasoned, "I will take care of him. You can live your life, and you will receive a decent allowance as a single mother according to the documents." Rachel took such a step for her grandson. If not for the opportunity of using child benefits, Eva would never have agreed to leave the baby, and Rachel would have never been granted guardianship. Hence, little Tyler stayed with his grandmother in the village. He only knew about his mother, the beautiful Eva, from his grandmother's stories, neighbours' accounts, and photographs. Eva showed little interest in her son's life, only periodically visiting her mother to rest between her complicated love affairs. In Tyler's memory, she remained as a vague image, a woman with a strange smell, hoarse, noisy, and unpleasant. She used to shout at his grandmother, demanding something from her, and little Tyler was always scared. However, it didn't last long, as Eva passed away when he was barely 4. Her next cohabitant in a drunken brawl did not calculate his strength, and the final of Eva's life was very logical. In the years that followed, Rachel often told Tyler that she was able to survive that difficult period after Eva's passing, thanks only to her little grandson, whom she had to care for. Tyler and his grandmother lived modestly. The times were tough, and his grandmother's salary didn't afford luxuries yet. Tyler thought of his childhood as happy. He had a caring grandmother, friends, a comfortable bed, and the aroma of pies and fried potatoes. He didn't have an expensive computer or branded sneakers, but he never went hungry or wore rags. Tyler tried to assist his grandmother in every way possible. As he grew, he understood that her life was not easy. He tried to bring her as much joy as he could. Unfortunately, he struggled with his studies. His grandmother helped him and tried to explain complex topics, but he had difficulty understanding. "That's because Eva drank when she was pregnant with him," remarked Mrs. Peterson, the grandmother's neighbour. They were in the kitchen, thinking Tyler couldn't hear them. "Oh, what difference does it make?" Rachel retorted. "The main thing is, he's healthy, strong and kind. Not everyone needs to be a scientist. Tyler will find his place in life, just like his grandfather. He's very handy." Tyler indeed was a handyman. Whether it was fixing or creating something, he was the person for the task. No one specifically taught him these skills. He learned by observing others and picked it up quickly, unlike mathematics. By the time Tyler finished school, his small family's financial situation had significantly deteriorated. The earnings from the farm were minimal, and his grandmother's pension was a pittance compared to the ever-rising costs. To supplement their income, Tyler took on odd jobs, repairing neighbours' fences, mowing lawns, digging land in the gardens, and even assisting in house construction. However, these jobs were sporadic and paid little. Given his unimpressive grades, college seemed out of the question. Despite this, Tyler decided to move to the city, hoping to find better earning opportunities and improve his life. He felt obliged to support his grandmother financially, as she had already sacrificed a lot for him. "Go," his grandmother said to him. "You're responsible and resilient. I'm less worried for you than I was for Eva. You'll find your way. Just be careful. You're still young and the world is full of dangers." "Don't worry, Grandma," Tyler consoled her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Everything will be fine. I'll work at a construction site as a labourer. I can mix cement, lay bricks, plaster and paint. I can do it all. When I'm back on my feet, I'll move you into town." Grandma smiled, her eyes tinged with sadness. Despite her assurances that Tyler would be fine, she seemed to have a sense of impending trouble. Initially, the city overwhelmed Tyler. The bustling crowds and streams of cars were a stark contrast to his previous visits. He had visited the city with his grandmother for shopping or paperwork, but living alone in this bustling metropolis was a different story. He was unsure of where to start. Prior to his move, Tyler had found several job advertisements. Construction sites were frequently hiring, so he decided to apply. His skills were a welcome addition to a team constructing a supermarket. The project was nearing completion, and they needed help with the finishing work. Tyler was a perfect fit. He even received accommodations, a small trailer house, which he shared with the other workers, but it was free. Upon receiving his first paycheck, Tyler promptly rented an apartment. He was considering job hunting again when work found him. One of his roommates from the construction site offered him a job on a new project. "They pay well," the man assured him, "but only when the work will be done." Tyler didn't mind this arrangement, since he used to trust people. He had saved money from his previous job, so he wasn't anxious about his living expenses. With the work progressing well, he looked forward to earning well and helping his grandmother. He knew she had debts from borrowing money to send him to the city, with some cash in hand. Soon he would be able to repay her, and even give her a little extra. She would be thrilled. But the deal didn't go as planned. This time, the owners blatantly exploited the workers and disappeared with their money. There was no use contacting the police or the Labour Inspectorate, as there were no official agreements or contracts, and nobody would take the workers' word. Tyler found himself in a dire situation. His savings were gone. He couldn't afford his apartment rent, and barely had money for food. He tirelessly scoured the city for work, but to no avail. There was no demand for unskilled labourers at the moment. One day, after another unsuccessful job search at a construction site, Tyler was walking towards the bus stop, feeling a mix of fear, despair and resentment. Suddenly he heard, "Hey, man, are you looking for work?" Tyler turned around to see two men, around 25, tall and tanned. They were obviously construction workers due to their weathered, tanned faces and broad, dirt-covered hands. "Yes," Tyler nodded. "Why?" "We need helpers, just to move some stuff from a cottage into a car. The work is simple, and the pay isn't bad." Doubt crept into Tyler's mind. What if it's a scam again? He didn't want to make the same mistake twice. He was eager to find an official job, and for this he should stay in the city, which meant paying rent and buying food. So Tyler decided to take a risk. "I'm in," he said. "All right," his interlocutor responded. "We'll meet here tonight at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock at night? Tyler asked, finding it odd. Why so late? The owners leave late. We follow them into the house, start clearing it out. They don't want to be involved in all this fuss, which is why they pay well. Tyler shrugged. The wealthy had their peculiarities. I will be, he promised his new acquaintances. When the time came, Tyler was at the designated spot. The men he'd met earlier were late, or perhaps they wouldn't show up at all. Tyler wouldn't mind. He needed the money, but these men seemed shady. There was a lack of sincerity, a falseness about them. Tyler was really afraid that they would cheat him, not pay him, just like on the previous job. Nonetheless, 10 minutes later the guys arrived in an old, broken-down truck. The driver's door opened and one of Tyler's daytime acquaintances peered out. Why are you standing there? Get in! We're already late. Tyler complied and settled into the seat next to the driver. The other man was there too, offering a quiet hello before returning his gaze to the window. Unlike his companion, this second man was silent and stern. They drove for nearly an hour, first through the city, then onto the highway, and finally onto a rough country road. Tyler's suspicion grew with every passing minute, but he realized that it was unlikely he could extricate himself from the situation quickly or easily. At best, these two might leave him penniless in the middle of nowhere. He didn't dare think about the worst-case scenario. The driver intermittently cracked jokes and flashed smiles. Tyler sensed he was putting on a brave front, attempting to appear calm and composed, but was internally anxious. The other man remained as silent as ever, not responding to his friend's remarks, just focusing on the road. Eventually, the truck halted near a house enclosed by a high fence. The driver unlocked the gate with a key. Tyler exhaled in relief. Since the driver had a key, things were probably okay. "You stay in the yard, we'll go inside," the driver instructed. "We'll hand you the boxes, you put them in the truck. We'll be finished in no time." The men hid in the house. Tyler noticed they also had a key to the front door. It was silent and dark, the way only the countryside can be. Large stars peered down from the sky. Tyler couldn't help but admire the night sky, as it reminded him of his own village and of his grandmother. "I wonder what she's doing now. Probably having tea with Mrs. Peterson in her cosy kitchen. They're likely talking about me," he thought. He yearned to return home, to the only person he truly knew. He longed to be a little boy again, viewing his grandmother as a loving and all-powerful figure. His pleasant thoughts were interrupted by the driver's gruff voice. "What are you daydreaming about? You're standing here like a statue. Grab the box!" Tyler dutifully hauled the heavy box into the truck. "I wonder what's inside. Books, dishes, or just some household items?" he pondered. No sooner had Tyler stepped back onto the porch than the silence of the September night was shattered by the wail of a police siren. The darkness was pierced by the glow of a flashing beacon. Tyler hoped the police cars would continue past the station to an accident scene, but instead they halted right outside the gate. Everything happened rapidly. The garden was quickly filled with uniformed people. Some officers rushed into the house, others began searching the truck. Tyler was easily thrown to the ground as if he weighed nothing. His arms were painfully twisted behind his back, dry grass tickling his face, sand filling his nose and mouth. He sneezed once, then again. Breathing became difficult. Someone roughly turned Tyler's face to the side, and he took greedy gulps of air. Later in the police station, Tyler was sitting handcuffed on a hard bench with uniformed men on either side. There was no sign of the driver or the other man. They seemed to have escaped. Tyler inferred this from snippets of conversation between the law enforcement officers. "Where are your accomplices?" a sturdy man in camouflage asked Tyler. "Do you know where they went?" Tyler shook his head. He wanted to explain that the escapees weren't his accomplices, that they'd only met that morning. They had simply offered him a job because he desperately needed the money. But he remained silent. For one, they wouldn't believe him. He had rehearsed his speech in his head, and it sounded unlikely. Secondly, his tongue felt foreign from fear, as if it were far too large and immovable. His mouth was also dry. He was thirsty, but he didn't dare ask the police for water. "Do you know whose house you were going to rob?" the man in camouflage asked again. "Prosecutor Hamilton's." "That's whose. Idiot. You'll face the full consequences now." Tyler was then interrogated by an investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired, angry look, who questioned him as though he were a hardened criminal. Tyler told the truth, but was not believed, understandably. After all, the other two had fled and vanished. They were being sought after, and Tyler had assumed that the police would not be successful. Now he was convinced he had encountered seasoned criminals. It turned out the truck used by the thieves had been stolen, and the police decided to blame this on Tyler as well. His protests that he didn't know how to drive fell on deaf ears. "I don't even have a license." "It's easy to verify," he tried to argue. "And we have half the country driving without a license. It's not a hindrance," was the answer to him. The trial occurred surprisingly quickly, mere days after the arrest. Tyler, the defendant, didn't anticipate seeing his grandmother there, but she had been informed in time. Despite knowing his innocence, he couldn't meet her gaze out of shame, fearing she saw him as a criminal. His grandmother seemed thinner and older, her face marked by shadows and wrinkles. Her anxious gaze was tinged with sadness, yet filled with love. She looked at Tyler without judgment, her tenderness giving him strength. As the judge announced the verdict, Tyler's world dimmed. He had braced for conviction but hoped for a more lenient sentence, even house arrest, considering he wasn't a repeat offender. But the judge's verdict was ruthlessly 6 years in a prison. The grandmother gasped, clutching her heart, her eyes turning grey. "What is this? He's practically a child. Adult criminals confused him, tricked him, and escaped. It's clear as day." Tyler was sent to a penal colony in another region. Long grey days stretched on, each resembling the last. His routine consisted of waking up, having a meagre breakfast, working in the industrial zone, walking in the cramped prison yard, undergoing occasional searches and inspections, eating lunch and dinner, having a periodic medical examination, and observing occasional holidays for the prisoners. His life was filled with dull monotony, a peculiar odour, dirt, despair, and fear. Luckily, Tyler's cellmates were more humane than the guards. Each had their own complex fate. As the youngest, Tyler was pitied, in a way. They understood that he was simply unlucky to have encountered such dangerous people at a young age. Now, Tyler had plenty of time to reflect. He was learning about life and people in this harsh environment. He realized how naive and foolish he had been. If given the chance, he would not make the same mistake again, but there's no point in regretting after the fact. Sometimes Tyler's grandmother visited him. Each time he noticed new wrinkles on her face. As he grew from a boy into a man, his grandmother was aging. He knew that his grandmother now had heart problems. He also knew that he was the cause of her illness. His actions had caused her worry, leading to her serious health problems. Tyler knew she had tried to appeal for leniency for him several times, even hiring lawyers, but it was to no avail. Tyler was given the maximum punishment, primarily because the victim was the prosecutor, who was known for their influential connections. Over those 6 years, Tyler often wished he could go back to that fateful day and refuse the offer from the two strangers to earn money. His life could have turned out differently. "It's all right, grandson. Everything happens," his grandmother reassured him. Tyler tried to put on a brave face, but Rachel saw and understood everything. "You've been deceived. It happens to everyone. The price is high, but it's just the beginning of life. You'll recover. Everything will be all right." Tyler smiled. His grandmother's words lightened and warmed his soul. It started to feel like everything would work out. Most importantly, he had someone who loved him, waited for him, and would never deceive or abandon him. Then his grandmother suddenly stopped visiting him. Tyler became worried when she didn't show up for his birthday. She always made it a point to visit on his birthday, but this time she was absent. Her phone went unanswered. All his attempts to get in touch with his beloved granny were in vain, with only a long beep on the other end. Finally, Tyler was called to the visiting room. He rushed in, relieved, already imagining hugging his grandmother and telling her how much he missed her. However, sitting on the familiar grey sofa was their neighbour, Mrs. Peterson, who looked tense and worried. At that moment, Tyler felt the ground slip from beneath his feet. He instantly knew that something terrible had happened. "Oh, Tyler," whispered Mrs. Peterson, awkwardly hugging her neighbour. "You've grown taller, but you've lost weight. Don't they feed you here?" With a trembling voice, and periodically wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, Mrs. Peterson delivered the dreadful news to Tyler. "Rachel is dead. She had a heart attack and the ambulance didn't arrive in time. She was so looking forward to your return, and she had made so many plans." Mrs. Peterson sobbed. It was clear that she was still grappling with the loss of her friend and neighbour. Neighbours arranged the funeral. It seemed like someone tried to get Tyler permission to say goodbye to his grandmother, but he was neither allowed to attend the event, nor was he informed of the tragedy. "How can this be? How can I come home and she's not there?" Tyler muttered in disbelief. "I'm very sorry, Tyler, but you have no home to return to," Mrs. Peterson said, looking at Tyler with a confused expression. "You don't know, do you?" It turned out that after Tyler was incarcerated, Rachel took out loans, hoping that good lawyers could get her beloved grandson out of jail. But even with good lawyers, nothing worked. The loans were secured against the house, and when the owner died, the property was taken over by the bank. The second blow was less shocking than the first, but it still hurt. Tyler's house was more than just a building. It was his sanctuary, filled with pleasant memories. The thought of someone else living there was unsettling. After that, Tyler felt lonely and unwanted. With no grandmother, he wondered about his purpose. He had always thought it was to care for his grandmother in her old age. But now, what was it all for? Regardless, he had to keep living. Tyler adjusted to the cold and darkness that engulfed him. He ate, slept, and worked automatically, constantly plagued by childhood memories of a young, stronger grandmother. He had promised to support her in his old age, but she never lived to be old. Freedom did not bring the anticipated joy, but instead confusion. He was overwhelmed with questions. Where to go? What to do? Where to sleep? Where to eat? Fortunately, his years of work in the workshop at the prison had earned him some money and skills. With all this, he headed to the city. He knew no one was waiting for him in the village. Although Mrs. Peterson had offered to take him in after his release, he understood that it was only out of politeness. Why would she want a criminal in her house? In the city, Tyler's money quickly depleted within a week, spent on hostel stays and food. Then, challenging times began. He experienced homelessness and resorted to scavenging from trash bins. A few times, Tyler felt so ill that he believed he wouldn't survive. However, his youth allowed him to recover again and again, and his unfulfilling, joyless life persisted. Tyler was disgusted by the person he had become, a destitute vagrant. This was not the life he had envisioned for himself as an adult. He could only imagine his grandmother's disappointment. Then one day, while passing by a construction site, Tyler noticed a tiler incorrectly installing tiles and gave him advice on how to do it easier and better. The tiler was initially skeptical of Tyler's advice, but upon following it, he was pleased with the result. And the unbelievable happened. Tyler was offered a job. Of course, he jumped at the opportunity. The foreman's name was Jorge, and he ran a small construction and installation team. His team engaged in minor repairs and small building projects, needed capable workers. Tyler was thrilled to have steady work after years of hardship. Jorge valued Tyler's diligence and skill. Learning with time about his past, Jorge acted as his mentor and helped Tyler with various aspects of life, including paperwork, major purchases, and medical needs. He also advised Tyler to start saving for a place of his own, underscoring that a man needs his own space, even if it's a modest apartment in a remote area. Tyler began to save money, gradually, month by month. He kept his savings in a secret pocket he had made in his shirt. Upon discovering this, Jorge explained, "Are you crazy? Who does that?" Confused, Tyler replied, "Where else should I keep it? Like buried treasure in the forest?" "Not like buried treasure, but in a bank." "We'll open an account," Jorge proposed. Tyler was initially reluctant to entrust his hard-earned money to a bank, having been deceived numerous times in the past. However, Jorge managed to convince him. As a result, Tyler, who was once homeless, now had his own bank account that he regularly deposited into. The balance kept growing, and he hoped to someday use it to buy a house in the village or an apartment. Living in the hostel introduced Tyler to various people with fascinating, sometimes complicated, or even scary life stories. The hostel inhabitants, reminiscent of trained fellow travellers, freely shared details of their lives. One day a new neighbour came to the room. He was a man slightly older than Tyler, accompanied by a boy of about 6 years old. The child and the man bore a striking resemblance, with the same green eyes, a sly squint, copper red hair, and freckles on their faces and hands. It was clear that they were father and son, Darrell and little Jacob. Like most permanent residents of the hostel, they had a difficult past. Tyler learned their story after 3 or 4 days of living next to the red-haired duo. Darrell, like Tyler, was raised in a village by his mother. He never knew his father. Although they lived impoverished, they did not starve, and there was always food in the house. Darrell's mother worked while he studied diligently. He was a good student with a dream to enroll in the college. He believed that people with high education were almost heaven's inhabitants. They have a good job, have a good car, live in a spacious apartment, and of course earn a lot of money. Darrell envisioned an apartment in a big city, a nice car, and trips to the sea. "You see, I wanted to take my mother to the sea," Darrell whispered confidently to Tyler. The lights in the room were already off, and the rhythmic snoring from the numerous hostel bunks filled the air. Little Jacob was asleep, curled up under his blanket, while Darrell and Tyler were talking about their lives. Darrell knew that his mother struggled to raise him alone, and he yearned to grow up quickly, stand on his own feet, and give her a fairy tale life. His mother had never been to the sea. She couldn't afford such trips, but Darrell knew she dreamed of it. She watched movies about the sea and lingered over photos of acquaintances on beach vacations. It seemed she even dreamed of the sea. Darrell eventually went to college and moved to the city to live in a dormitory, while his mother stayed in the village. His dreams were gradually more realistic. He learned that finding a job could be challenging, and a job with decent pay is even more challenging. However, Darrell was determined to succeed, inspired by others who fought for their place under the sun. As he grew older, he realized that success often required influence and money, which he, as a country boy, lacked. After college, he found a job in the municipal department for a small wage. Darrell, a fresh college graduate, was grateful for this opportunity. It was a better option than being unemployed. He rented a tiny apartment and gradually adjusted to his new life. His mother was proud of him for making a life in the city. She was the only one who believed in Darrell's bright future, and her faith kept him going. And then my mother died. Darrell lowered his head. Even in the semi-darkness, Tyler noticed that the man was struggling to hold back tears. It was clear the wound hadn't healed yet. Her heart, the doctors later told us, needed surgery long ago. But my mother, she thought it would pass. She kept taking pills, delaying her hospital visit. I know why. She feared they wouldn't let her go back to work. Sure, they'd allow sick leave, but during her treatment, they'd find a way to fire her. It's happened. They only want healthy young workers. My mother, she was afraid of being left without money. She had no one to rely on. I was hardly a protector or benefactor, barely able to make ends meet. I blamed myself for not being able to support my mother. I didn't have opportunity yet. The loss hit Darrell hard. The realization of what had happened came gradually. Tyler understood his hostile neighbor like no one else. Darrell's story seemed to transport him back to when he was suddenly left without his grandmother. I don't know what would have happened to me in the end, Darrell continued. Maybe I would have lived like a robot, or perhaps I would have done something stupid. So many thoughts were rushing in my head then. It's difficult to remember now. But then Abigail appeared in my life, and everything changed. I can't even explain how. She pulled me out of it. Abigail found work at the same office where Darrell worked. She was a sweet, modest girl with perpetually anxious grey eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. And then one day, Darryl was rushing to a neighbouring office and collided with her and grabbed her by the shoulders, preventing her from falling. "Sorry," Darryl muttered, ready to continue on his way, and suddenly he looked into her eyes. Of course, Darryl had seen Abigail before, in the office, at work, at general meetings, in the canteen, even on the street. He saw her, but he didn't notice her. After his mother's death, everything around him seemed grey and unimpressive. But Abigail's eyes were like the bottomless lakes that were impossible to ignore. They were the kind, anxious eyes of a Disney cartoon reindeer, filled with so much concern and apprehension. Darryl suddenly found himself drawn to this girl who seemed strong, confident, and almost omnipotent. He yearned to be near her, to care for her, and to protect her from life's dangers. For the first time since a tragedy, he felt alive. They paused in the corridor, forgetting their respective destinations. Darryl apologised for bumping into her and smiled. Abigail assured him it was no big deal. One word led to another, resulting in a first date. This marked the beginning of their acquaintance. It soon became apparent that Abigail and Darryl had much in common. They were the same age, and at a young age, both were independently navigating the world. They had no one, no older relatives to guide them, no supportive mentors, and no close friends. Abigail had been raised in an orphanage. Her only knowledge of her parents was that they were alcoholics, a description shared by her caretaker. She was taken from her parents due to the risk they posed to her safety. Darryl and Abigail, once alone in the world, suddenly found each other. Their newfound companionship brought happiness to both of them. They didn't wait long to get married. Only a couple of months after meeting, they moved into a rented apartment together as a family. Darryl made their home cosier and more comfortable. He whitewashed the ceilings, painted the walls, fixed a persistent leaky faucet, and even replaced the wiring. Abigail, on the other hand, took care of Darryl. She prepared delicious meals, ironed his shirts, and always showed interest in his day. This made both of them feel important, loved, and no longer alone in the world. Their lives took on new, vibrant colours. Soon a wonderful event unfolded. Abigail announced that she was expecting a child. They hadn't planned for a child so soon, but the news brought joy to both of them. Of course, they also felt some apprehension. How would they manage a baby? They had no one to help or guide them, and would they have enough money to support a child? Despite these concerns, joyful emotions prevailed within the expecting parents. Darryl made a bold move. He resigned from his low-paying job and took up a position for a private company. It offered a much better salary, but also required more work. He had to study hard, grasp the intricacies of complex cases, and often stay late at the office. Abigail left her job, and settling into her new role at home, she focused on household chores and anticipating the arrival of her baby. When the boy's son was born, Abigail and Darryl were overjoyed. The baby resembled his father with his green eyes and red hair, and they named him Jacob. Raising a child was costly. Expenses like diapers, special food and clothing that Jacob quickly outgrew added up, not to mention the cost of medication, strollers, cribs and toys. Darryl worked tirelessly to ensure his family wanted for nothing. Everything was fine until, after much thought, Darryl and Abigail decided to apply for a mortgage. They planned to use the money from selling Darryl's inherited village house as a down payment. This was a risky move, but Darryl had a good salary, and as Jacob was growing older, Abigail planned to return to work. They believed the mortgage payments would be manageable and acceptable. Thus, their journey began. Initially, everything went smoothly. Buyers were found quickly, even though Darryl anticipated it would be a challenge. The money was used both for mortgage payments and repairs. Abigail and Darryl moved into a spacious two-bedroom apartment in a good neighbourhood. The repairs were completed quickly due to their available funds. They furnished the rooms with affordable modern furniture, hung beautiful curtains, and adorned the walls with framed photos of themselves and their son Jacob. Darryl fondly recalled their first New Year in the new place. They had just finished renovating. The rooms still held the scent of wallpaper glue and new furniture. Their apartment was beautiful, clean and cosy. A large Christmas tree, almost reaching the ceiling, stood in the corner of the living room. Little Jacob, in his adorable pyjamas, was entranced by the twinkling lights of the garlands wrapped around the tree. With the overhead lights turned off, the glow from the garlands and the flickering TV screen created a warm, almost magical atmosphere. Darryl looked at his wife and son, and their tastefully furnished apartment. The table was laden with delicious dishes, chicken with potatoes, salads, fruit, and of course champagne. What would New Year's Eve be without champagne? At that moment, Darryl felt blissfully content. His beloved family was nearby, and it seemed that things could only improve from there. Darryl was proud of himself. He had achieved what they had once thought was unattainable. On that peaceful, magical evening, the couple was unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. The following year marked the start of a new chapter. Jacob began kindergarten, and to the surprise of his parents, adapted to the preschool environment with ease. There were no tantrums or bouts of illnesses that typically concerned young parents. Meanwhile, Abigail found employment as a sales manager. With a large portion of the family's income going towards mortgage payments, the additional income was a welcome relief. However, by the fall, Abigail, who was still young and vibrant, began to experience dizziness, nausea, and a loss of appetite. Initially, both Darryl and Abigail suspected a pregnancy. In the women's consultation, they were informed that Abigail was not pregnant. However, her test results were concerning, and she was advised to consult a family doctor. The examinations took up a lot of time and effort. She had to leave work all the time, which of course her superiors did not like. During this period, his wife's eyes held a certain guilt, anxiety and confusion. Darryl's heart ached with pity each time he looked at her. He held on to the belief that everything would be okay. Maybe she was just lacking some vitamins or had a minor organ malfunction. He was confident that they would find the issue, treat it, and everything would return to normal. The diagnosis, however, came unexpectedly. A rare, presumably hereditary blood disorder. But the origin of the disease didn't matter. What mattered was that the treatment would be long, costly, and without any guaranteed success. The doctors, with brutal honesty, outlined the most likely scenario. Despite treatment, the disease would likely progress. Abigail reacted to her diagnosis with apparent strength, perhaps putting on a brave front for her husband and son. Darryl, in contrast, felt as if he'd been blindsided. He felt dazed, exhausted, and utterly disoriented for a long time. How could this be? Where did this misfortune come from? They had just started a new life, with numerous plans and wonderful ideas. Darryl eventually accepted the situation and began to take action. His first step was to find doctors experienced in treating patients like his wife. However, this was far from cheap. He had to sell some belongings, take out loans, and despite all this, the mortgage still needed to be paid. Darryl was working alone again. Abigail became extremely weak, and her treatment consumed most of her time. Their son Jacob was well behaved, becoming increasingly aware that his mother was sick and his father was working hard. He learned to take care of himself, prepare his clothes for the morning, make tea for himself and his mother, and make sandwiches. He was maturing quickly, and others began to use him as an example for their own children. But Darryl wished none of this ever happened. He wished his son were just like any other child his age, not knowing how to tie his shoelaces or cook an omelette. Abigail wasn't getting better with the treatment they could afford. The family was in debt, and all their efforts seemed to be in vain. Abigail was slowly fading, becoming a pale shadow of her former self. Darrell approached charitable foundations and sought consultations with eminent professors. Sometimes he succeeded in getting these consultations, but even these medical experts were at a loss. Abigail's disease was not well understood and was unpredictable. No one knew how to help her. Traditional treatment had almost no effect. Abigail was eventually taken to a hospital after being ill for approximately 3 years. She had become so weak that she could not even eat. Darrell, preparing for a long struggle, hired a nurse to provide extra care for his wife. However, none of this was needed. Abigail passed away a week after she was admitted to the hospital. Darrell faced the heartbreaking reality of his wife's death. The situation was worsened by the fact that he now had to explain to their son Jacob that his mother was gone. To add to his troubles, Darrell lost his job when the firm he worked at went bankrupt. The owner had always taken big risks for potential profits, and one miscalculation led to the firm's downfall. During Abigail's illness, the family had accumulated a lot of debt, and the mortgage payments were burdensome. Darrell found a new job that paid much less, but he had no other options yet. Darrell worked at his new office job during the day. In the evenings he took on additional work, unloading trucks at a store or assisting with repairs. Jacob was always able to occupy himself, despite being alone most of the time. He loved to draw, using pencils or paints and a sheet of paper to escape from his grey reality. His creations were full of bright rainbows, dense forests, and cute, big-eyed animals that didn't exist in real life. Darrell wasn't worried about Jacob going hungry, as long as there was bread, sausage, eggs, milk, and frozen dumplings in the refrigerator. Jacob could manage meals on his own, even feeding his father after a long day of work. Their lifestyle continued until their apartment was seized by the bank due to unpaid debts, including an overdue mortgage and loans. Despite Darrell's efforts to fight for his property, it was to no avail. Ultimately, to avoid attracting attention from the guardianship authorities, they had to accept their fate. This led to Darrell and Jacob residing in a hostel. Tyler quickly befriended Darrell and his 6-year-old son, Jacob. He admired Darrell's hard work and Jacob's maturity. The three of them often dined together, and Tyler occasionally took Jacob for walks. Darrell worked long hours, and the dark hostel was a dull environment for a child. During their walks, Tyler and Jacob discussed various topics and shared personal stories. Tyler discovered that Jacob aspired to be an artist, but understood the need for education to achieve this goal. Jacob was aware his father lacked the resources to enroll him in art classes, which disheartened him. Nevertheless, he remained hopeful about the prospect of free classes. While Jacob eagerly awaited the start of school, Darrell dreaded it. He knew that their homeless situation would inevitably draw the attention of guardianship authorities. A child should have a home, a stable environment, and a bed of his own, while Jacob was living in a hostel and essentially wandering with his homeless father. Darrell feared that the authorities would take Jacob away and place him in an orphanage. Having heard from Abigail about life in an orphanage, Darren was determined to prevent this scenario for his own son. However, he felt powerless and lacked support, and in short, his situation felt desperate. Tyler winced. Whether from the biting wind or the sudden surge of thoughts and memories was unclear. The fall had been harsh, and he found himself longing for winter. He thought of the soon-to-come snow, which would make everything brighter, more graceful and softer. Tyler knew that little Jacob was eagerly awaiting the new year, the gifts, the festive meal, and making a wish. Despite his growing independence, Jacob was still a child at heart, genuinely believing that the wish made at the stroke of midnight would come true. Tyler knew exactly what he would ask from Santa Claus, or whoever else might listen. It was clear what Jacob wished for. He would ask for a good apartment for himself and his father, and an art school just for himself. It was a pity that neither of these wishes seemed likely to come true soon. Despite this, Tyler was determined to give Jacob something that would bring him joy. He had found a young artist's kit in a store. Expensive, but worth it for Jacob. It included a suitcase, an easel, a set of paints, pencils, and felt-tip pens. The thought of Jacob's eyes lighting up at the sight of this gift warmed Tyler's heart. There was nothing quite as satisfying as bringing joy to people, especially children. This miracle suitcase can only brighten a young boy's grey everyday life, but it can't solve all his and his father's problems. Tyler finally left the steps to the river and, reaching the embankment, rushed to work along the parapet. His boss, Jorge, valued his diligence and reliability, and Tyler didn't want to disappoint him. However, suddenly he noticed a crowd gathered around a lantern. Men, women, teenagers and children. They were having animated discussions. Some were making phone calls, and others were filming something on their phones. He followed their gazes to find the cause of the commotion. To his astonishment, in the dark waves of the broad river, about 30 meters from the shore, a human head appeared and disappeared. Someone was drowning, unable to muster any more strength. How did someone end up in the river at this season? However, Tyler didn't have time to think over it. Without a second thought, he ran to the water's edge, shedding his jacket, sweater and shoes along the way. These items would only weigh him down in the river's cold waves. Tyler was an excellent swimmer, having spent his childhood swimming and playing in the river near his village. By the age of 5 or 6, he felt as comfortable in the water as a fish. However, he had never swum in this weather, cold, windy, with a strong current. Nor had he ever rescued a drowning person. But he knew that if he didn't try to save this man, no one else would. He could imagine the desperation of the man in the water, surrounded by onlookers who were merely staring. Someone was calling for a rescue, but would they arrive in time? It was a matter of a minute. Tyler knew he had to at least try. The icy water stung Tyler's feet. He shivered, stepping forward, knowing the initial cold would give way to adaptation. And adapt he did. He was now bravely approaching the person who was drowning. Tyler's strength was vanishing, but he could see his target, a head with dark hair plastered to the face. It was a young girl. Her pale face and eyes were filled with desperation and horror. She was battling for her life with her last bit of strength. She must have been a skilled swimmer, otherwise she would have sunk long before. But Tyler knew that if he did not act quickly, she would still drown. Finally, he was close enough. He approached the girl from behind, remembering the crucial fact that a drowning person, in their desperation, can inadvertently drown their rescuer. So, he maintained a safe distance. He grabbed her by the scruff and pulled her towards the shore. Upon sensing help, the girl's first instinct was to cling to Tyler, but he did not yield. Gradually, she understood the situation, relaxed slightly, and allowed herself to be rescued. Already on the riverbank, with a silent look in the face of her rescuer, the poor girl fainted. People were waiting for them. Tyler was wrapped in a plaid and the girl was covered. The distant wail of an ambulance siren could be heard. The man looked around, realizing that everything would be all right. It was then that his hands started shaking, and his teeth began to chatter, either from the cold or the fear he had just experienced. At that time the paramedics arrived. An anxious tall man, dressed in an expensive jacket, came rushing from somewhere. He seemed to be the girl's father. Both of them shared similar features: hazel eyes, prominent noses, and defined cheekbones. Tyler didn't wait for the story to unfold. He dressed quickly and rushed to Jorge, confident that his boss would understand his tardiness once he explained the reason. However, it turned out that Jorge was late himself, so Tyler didn't have to justify his delay. 3 days later, Tyler was walking to the store to buy milk when suddenly he was called out. There was a man behind him who had familiar hazel eyes and was wearing a stylish jacket. Tyler immediately recognized him as the father of the girl he had rescued from the water. "I finally found you," the man said, smiling and extending his hand to Tyler. "It wasn't easy. My name is John Temple. I'm the father of the teenager you saved." "Hello," Tyler muttered. Tyler understood that this man wanted to thank him, but he was more interested in knowing how the girl was doing and why she was in the water. He had spent many days thinking about the girl he had rescued and hoped she was okay. "Thank goodness for social networks," the man continued. "Someone who was on the embankment that day posted a video. It clearly shows how you saved my Shelley. It was a brave and desperate act. There aren't many people like you around these days. We were lucky you were there." "How's the girl?" Tyler asked. As much as he appreciated John Temple's words, he felt a bit uneasy. "Shelley's fine. She's in a hospital now." "So she was hurt, after all." "Physically, she's almost fine. She's just a little cold. But that's not the point. Do you know how she ended up in the river? Did you witness that moment?" Tyler shook his head. "It was all due to unrequited love. She fell for a boy who began dating someone else. Shelley couldn't handle it, and now she's under the care of psychologists and is on the mend. Apparently she realized the magnitude of her mistake immediately in the icy water. But it was too late. If it hadn't been for you—" "The important thing is that she's okay now." Tyler smiled. "It was just an impulsive act on her part. I believe this situation has taught her a lot." "This situation has taught me a lot," admitted Mr. Temple. "I've been in business for many years and had started to believe that there were no good, selfless people left in the world, like you. I had become cynical, cold, indifferent. Your act, it taught me a lot and made me reevaluate my values." Tyler nodded. What else could he say? "I want to thank you. I can help you out. I know that you live in a hostel and don't have a place of your own. You are welcome to ask for anything you want. Anything at all. People like you deserve a better fate." Tyler paused, deep in thought. He remembered the worry in Darrell's eyes after receiving another notice from the guardianship authorities, and the way little Jacob spoke so passionately about his dream of becoming an artist. "My life is fulfilling," Tyler finally admitted. "But there's a young boy who could certainly use your assistance." "Tyler!" Jacob raced towards Tyler with the speed of a fighter jet. Grinning, the man opened his arms to catch the boy and twirl him around in celebration. "Tyler, I won first place in the city's drawing contest. Remember the Cosmos drawing I showed you?" "Of course I remember. I told you this would happen." Soon Darrell came up. They had decided to spend the sunny Sunday afternoon at the park. Jacob loved darting along the pavement, feeding the ducks at the pond, and observing the squirrels at play, while his father and his best friend Tyler were sitting at a nearby cafe, savouring coffee. More than a year had passed since Tyler's conversation with John Temple. The wealthy businessman was astounded by Tyler's request, as it wasn't for himself. He wanted to aid his friend, Darrell, who had a small child and was in a dire situation. John Temple purchased an apartment for Darrell. It was a one-bedroom flat in a new building, located in a good neighbourhood. Conveniently, there was a good school and an arts class nearby, where Darrell promptly enrolled Jacob. Jacob's talent blossomed dramatically, and his drawings became more refined and accurate, yet they retained their originality and spontaneity. Of course, John Temple could not help but do something for Tyler personally, although he did not ask him to do so. First, the businessman bought for Tyler an apartment next to Darrell and Jacob. Secondly, John Temple offered a high-paying job to the saviour of his daughter, hiring him as a gardener. Tyler, who always enjoyed gardening, found his place in this role. Initially, Shelley avoided the new gardener. She was likely afraid of the memories associated with him. However, they eventually became friends. Shelley regretted her act and, after some time, couldn't even explain to herself why she had made such a decision. Sometimes Tyler would look at Shelley, tall, thin and fragile, and his heart would tighten at the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't managed to pull her out of the water. While Darryl and Tyler were chatting sitting in the cafe, a petite woman with piercing blue eyes went inside and went straight to the men. "There you are! I thought you'd wait for me at the fountain." Tyler turned around, smiled, and hurried towards her. They had only met recently, but it was clear that their relationship was serious. Today they had agreed to go out together as a merry, noisy company. It was going to be a wonderful day.